The last of the rice made a tiny white pyramid in the bottom of the chipped porcelain bowl. May stared at it, her breath fogging in the frigid air of the shack. It was not enough for a meal. It was barely enough to be a memory of one. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled, a hungry animal clawing at the thin planks of the walls. It was the same wind that had taken her husband away, a sudden fever that burned through the railroad camp and left 3 women widows before the first snows of 1879 had fully settled. But the railroad company offered no comfort, only a final tally of Way's debt at the company store, a debt that now belonged to her. A sharp rap on the door made her flinch. It was too firm for a neighbor, too impatient for a friend, if she had any. She knew who it was. Jedediah Thorne, the owner of the store, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around the high collar of her gray cheongsam, the fabric worn but clean, a final bastion of dignity against the encroaching cold and desperation. She opened the door a crack. Thorne stood on her step, flanked by 2 men whose size was meant to be an argument in itself. He was dressed in a fine wool coat, his face pink from the cold, his expression one of polite, predatory concern. "Mrs. Lee," he began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A difficult day. I've come about the outstanding account." "I have nothing," May said, her voice quiet but steady. The words were simple fact, not a plea. Thorne's smile tightened. "That is unfortunate. The company has rules. Your husband's effects, such as they are, must be surrendered as collateral. You will, of course, need to vacate the premises. Perhaps some work can be found for you, at my store. Tidying up. We can discuss terms." The implication hung in the frozen air, colder than the wind. He was not offering a job. He was offering indenturement. The men behind him shifted, their presence filling the doorway, blocking out the pale winter light. May felt the floor beneath her feet turn to ice. This was it. The end of the path. There was nowhere left to go. But a voice, low and rough-edged, cut through the tension from the path. "There a problem here, Thorne?" A man stood there, leading a horse laden with supplies. He was tall and lean, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes a pale, startling blue. He wore a simple sheepskin coat over denim, and the gun belt on his hip looked less like a threat and more like a tool he was accustomed to carrying. It was Arthur Vance, a man who kept to himself on a ranch miles out of town, a man whispered about but seldom spoken to. Some said he had been a lawman, others said he had been the opposite. Everyone agreed he was best left alone. Thorne turned, his composure momentarily ruffled. "Vance, this is a private matter. A debt is being settled." Arthur's gaze moved from Thorne to May, standing small and still in the doorway of the shack. He saw the chipped bowl on the table behind her, the stark emptiness of the room. He saw the fear she refused to show in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in other places, on other faces. It always preceded a great injustice. "A debt," Arthur repeated, his voice flat. He looked back at Thorne. "How much?" "That is none of your concern," Thorne snapped. Arthur ignored him, his eyes still on May. He saw the careful stitching on her collar, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. He saw a woman holding herself together with thread and will. He made a decision. It was not a grand, heroic choice. It was a simple, practical one, the kind a man makes when he sees a fence that needs mending or a roof that needs patching. He took a step forward, and Thorne's men tensed. But Arthur's attention was fixed on the store owner. "She has a debt to work off? Fine. She'll work for me." The words dropped into the silence, heavy and final. Thorne stared, dumbfounded. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Arthur said. He turned his gaze fully to May, and for the first time, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He spoke to her as if the other men weren't there. "I can pay a fair wage, enough to cover any debt. It's hard work, mending, cooking, keeping a place from falling to pieces." He paused. "Come home and eat supper, ma'am. We can settle this." It was not a proposal. It was a lifeline, thrown across a chasm of cold and hunger. To Thorne, it was a public rebuke, a quiet rancher stepping in and declaring the debt settled in a way that left no room for argument. To May, it was something else entirely. It was a voice that did not demand or threaten, but simply offered. She looked from Thorne's cruel politeness to Arthur Vance's stark, unadorned offer. She gave a single, small nod. That was all. She stepped out of the shack, leaving the empty bowl and the ghost of her old life behind, and walked toward the quiet man and his horse. She did not yet know that the debt he had just assumed was far more complicated than a few dollars at a company store. The walk to his ranch was a long one, conducted in near silence. The snow crunched under their boots, a rhythmic, lonely sound. May followed a step behind Arthur, her eyes on the broad line of his shoulders. He did not try to make conversation, a mercy for which she was grateful. Words felt useless against the vast, white emptiness of the landscape. His ranch was not a grand affair. It was a small, sturdy cabin built of hand-hewn logs, a solid barn, and a web of corrals half buried in snow. It looked like a place built for endurance, not comfort. Inside, a fire was already laid in the stone hearth, waiting for a match. The cabin was one room, spare and meticulously clean. A bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and shelves holding tins of food, books, and neatly folded blankets. It was the home of a man who lived entirely on his own terms. Arthur gestured to a chair at the table. "Sit, warm yourself." He moved with an economy of motion, lighting the fire, hanging his coat, and starting to prepare a meal. He sliced bacon into a cast-iron skillet, the sizzle and scent filling the small cabin. He mixed flour and water for biscuits. He did it all with a quiet competence, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. May watched him, a strange feeling settling in her chest. It was the first time in months she had felt the simple warmth of a room without the gnawing anxiety of how she would pay for the wood to heat it. Supper was eaten in the same quiet way the journey was made. Bacon, biscuits, and beans from a can. It was the most satisfying meal she had had in a year. When they were finished, Arthur stood and took their plates to a wash basin. "There's a small room in the back," he said, not turning around, "for storage. I cleared it out. There's a cot. It's not much, but it's warm." "Thank you," she said. The words felt small, inadequate. He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You'll be safe here. Thorne won't trouble you." But trouble had a way of finding people, especially in a place as isolated as Granite Creek. 3 days later, the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray, and the wind began to shriek. A blizzard descended on the high plains, a white fury that erased the world. For 2 days and nights they were sealed inside the cabin, the snow piling up against the door and windows. The storm was a physical force, a constant roaring pressure. On the 3rd morning, the wind died down to a low moan. Arthur pulled on his heaviest coat. "The north fence will be down. Cattle will drift. Some might be lost already." He expected her to stay by the fire, to wait. But when he opened the door against a wall of snow, May was right behind him, wrapped in an old oilskin slicker he had given her. It was far too big, but she had cinched it with a piece of rope. "I can help," she said. It was not a question. He hesitated for only a second, then nodded. The work was brutal. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from their lungs. They waded through snow that was waist deep in the drifts, their faces raw from the wind. They found a section of the fence crushed by a fallen pine, just as Arthur had predicted. A dozen head of cattle had wandered out into the open, huddled together for warmth, their coats caked with ice. Getting them back was a slow, punishing process. Arthur worked with his horse, pushing the half-frozen animals through the deep snow, while May, armed with a long branch, kept the stragglers from breaking away. She was not strong, but she was relentless. She moved with a steady, determined rhythm, never complaining, never faltering, even when she stumbled and disappeared into a drift, only to push herself back up, covered in snow, and continue on. They worked until dusk, their bodies aching with cold and exhaustion. They managed to herd all but 2 of the cattle back into the corral. As they were securing the gate, Arthur noticed one of the calves was shivering violently, its breathing shallow. "It won't last the night out here," he said, his voice grim. Without a word, he bent down, heaved the young animal onto his shoulders, and began the long walk back to the barn. May followed, carrying his tools. Inside the relative warmth of the barn, he laid the calf on a bed of clean straw. He began rubbing its limbs vigorously, trying to bring back circulation. May went to a small stove in the corner of the tack room and, using the kindling Arthur kept there, managed to get a small fire going. She found a bucket and filled it with snow, melting it over the flames. She tore a strip from the hem of her own worn undergarment, dipped it in the warm water, and began to gently wash the ice from the calf's face. Arthur stopped what he was doing and watched her. He saw the gentle, practiced way her small hands moved, the focused concentration on her face. In that moment, she was not a fragile, displaced widow. She was as strong and resilient as the landscape itself. They worked together in the dim lantern light, a silent, coordinated team, until the calf finally gave a weak bleat and tried to lift its head. A small, weary smile touched Arthur's lips. He might just make it. When they finally returned to the cabin, soaked and bone-tired, the immediate crisis had passed. But as the blizzard broke and the world outside reappeared, they both knew the storm had changed something between them. They were no longer just a man who had offered charity and a woman who had accepted it. They were 2 people who had faced a common enemy and survived. A week later, the tracks were clear enough for a horse, and just as Arthur had predicted, Jedediah Thorne came riding up to the ranch. This time he had a man with him, wearing a tarnished territorial deputy badge. Thorne dismounted, his face a mask of smug authority. "Vance, I've come for the woman. You're harboring a debtor. That's obstruction." Arthur, who had been splitting wood, did not stop. He simply leaned his axe against the chopping block and turned to face them. May appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her expression calm. "She's working off the debt, Thorne. We had an agreement," Arthur said evenly. "A private agreement that has no legal standing," Thorne sneered. "Deputy, you are witness. I am here to reclaim my property." He looked pointedly at May. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He knew Arthur Vance by reputation and wanted no part of this. But Arthur didn't reach for the gun on his hip. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. It was a receipt from the general store in Granite Creek, the one that competed with Thorne's company store. It was dated the day after he brought May to the ranch. Marked in clear ink was the amount of Way's debt, paid in full, in cash. Thorne's face went from smug to slack-jawed. He stared at the paper as if it were a snake. "The debt is paid," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a hammer blow. "You have no business here." Publicly humiliated, with his rented lawman as a witness, Thorne had no choice. He snatched the reins of his horse, his face mottled with rage. As he mounted, he leaned down and spoke in a low, venomous voice, meant only for Arthur to hear. "You always did have a soft spot for strays, Vance. Almost got you killed once before, didn't it?" Thorne spurred his horse and rode away, leaving his words hanging in the cold, clean air. Arthur stood watching him go, the receipt still in his hand, and May saw a shadow pass over his face, a darkness that had nothing to do with the setting sun. The immediate threat was gone, but a much older, deeper one had just been brought into the light. That night the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of two people working together, but a tense, watchful stillness. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows that seemed to hide more than they revealed. May sat at the table, mending one of Arthur's shirts, her stitches small and even. Arthur stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit snow, though it was clear he was seeing something else entirely. Finally, May spoke, her voice soft. "What did he mean, Mr. Thorne?" Arthur did not turn. His shoulders were rigid. "It was a long time ago." "In another place," she stated, not a question. He gave a slight nod. The silence stretched again, pulled taut between them. May set down the shirt, her hands folded in her lap. She waited. She had learned that about him. He could not be pushed. His words, when they came, had to find their own way out. At last he turned from the window and came to sit in the other chair. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. "I wasn't always a rancher," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "I wore a badge, U.S. Marshal, out of Kansas." He spoke of a family, freedmen who had filed a homestead claim on a piece of good bottom land. But a powerful cattle baron wanted the water rights that came with it. The baron used threats, then violence. Arthur was assigned to protect the family. He lived with them for a month, sharing their meals, watching their children play. He came to respect their courage, their unshakable belief in the law and the piece of paper that said the land was theirs. "Thorne is right about one thing," Arthur said, a bitter edge to his voice. "I have a soft spot for people trying to build something on nothing but grit." The cattle baron hired men. They came at night. Arthur was ready for them, but there were more than he expected. A gunfight erupted in the dark. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the hired men were dead, and Arthur had a bullet in his side. But that wasn't the worst of it. The homesteader, a good man named Joseph, had been killed defending his home, his deed to the land clutched in his hand. His wife, she looked at me. Arthur's voice cracked slightly, the first break in his composure May had ever witnessed. She didn't say a word, just looked at me. I was the law. I was supposed to keep them safe, and her husband was dead. He looked down at his own hands as if they were foreign objects. "I turned in my badge the next week, came here, bought this place. Figured if I just kept to myself, I couldn't fail anyone else." He had run not from the danger, but from the weight of his own principles. His isolation was not a preference, it was a penance. May listened, her heart aching for the story he told and for the man who had carried it alone for so long. He had seen her not as a stray, but as someone like Joseph's family, someone standing on a small patch of ground, armed with nothing but a claim to a life they deserved. When he finished, the cabin was utterly still. May reached into the sleeve of her cheongsam and drew out a small, intricately folded piece of paper. It was worn soft at the creases, a sign of having been handled many times. She unfolded it carefully on the table between them. It was a letter, written in English. "My husband, Wei," she said. "He told me to keep this safe. He said it was important. My English It is not so good. I can read some words, but not all." Arthur picked up the letter. The handwriting was neat, precise. He began to read aloud. It was mostly a work agreement with the railroad, detailing pay and conditions, but near the bottom a paragraph caught his eye. It spoke of a bonus promised for the dangerous work of blasting through granite, a bonus none of the Chinese workers had ever received. And then came the last sentence. "The crew foreman keeps 2 ledgers. I have seen the real one. He shows the company the book with the lower wages and pockets the difference. His name is Jedediah Thorne." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Arthur read the sentence again, the pieces clicking into place with a dreadful certainty. Thorne hadn't been just a greedy store owner collecting a small debt. He had been systematically stealing from his workers. Way had found out. Way's death in the fever camp, a place where sickness spread like fire, was suddenly no longer a simple tragedy. It was a terrible convenience for a man with a secret to keep. Thorne's attempts to get May out of the shack and under his control were not about the money. He was hunting for this letter, for the proof. "He killed him," May whispered, the realization dawning on her face, a mask of quiet horror. "It was not the fever." "No," Arthur said, his voice hard as iron. "I don't think it was." He looked at the letter in his hand, then at May. He saw the path ahead, clear and unavoidable. He could burn the letter, and Thorne would likely leave them alone. They could live here in quiet safety, and no one would ever know. Or he could take this piece of paper to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. That meant riding back into the world he had abandoned. It meant facing down a man who had already killed to protect his secrets. It meant putting May, the woman he had sworn to protect, in the center of that danger. He had run from this choice once before. He would not do it again. "Pack what you have," he said, his decision made. "We leave for Cheyenne at first light." 4 months later, the last of the snow had retreated to the high peaks, leaving the valley floor awash in the pale green of new grass. The air was soft with the promise of spring. Arthur Vance was back at his ranch, mending a section of fence that had been weakened by the winter storms. The work was familiar, the rhythm of it steadying, but nothing else was the same. The journey to Cheyenne had been fraught with tension, the constant feeling of being watched dogging their every step. But they had made it. The territorial marshal, a man who remembered Arthur's name, had listened to their story and examined the letter. He had seen the truth in it. An investigation was launched, and the second ledger was found, hidden beneath a floorboard in Thorne's office. Jedediah Thorne was now in a federal jail, his crimes laid bare, awaiting a trial that he would not win. The railroad, facing a scandal, had quickly paid the stolen back wages to the families of the Chinese workers. A representative had delivered an envelope to May. It contained enough money for her to be independent, to go anywhere she chose. But she had chosen to return with Arthur to the ranch. Now the place felt different. A sturdy chicken coop stood near the barn, its occupants clucking and scratching in the sun. Beside the cabin, a patch of earth had been tilled and raked into neat rows, ready for a vegetable garden. These were May's contributions, signs of a life being put down, of roots taking hold in the stubborn soil. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. Arthur finished stretching a length of wire and paused, wiping his brow. He saw May walking toward him from the cabin, carrying a steaming mug. She moved with a new confidence, a quiet grace that seemed to belong to this land now. She handed him the mug of tea. "You work too hard," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. His gaze lingered on her face, then dropped to the mug. He recognized it. It was the same chipped porcelain bowl she'd held her last grains of rice in, repurposed now for a different, better life. He thought of the desperate, haunted woman he had met in the doorway of that shack, and the calm, resilient woman who stood before him now. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his own where it rested on the mug. His hand was large, calloused, and weathered. Hers was small and delicate, yet possessed a strength he had come to admire more than any other quality. It was a simple, silent gesture that said more than words ever could. She did not pull away. She simply met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the wide-open sky. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet. "I thought being alone was the same as being safe." May didn't answer right away. She just watched him, allowing the truth of his words to settle in the warm spring air between them. In that shared stillness, a future that neither of them had dared to imagine was beginning to grow. It was a life built not on grand promises or dramatic declarations, but on the simple, profound decency of a shared supper on a cold winter's night. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.